If you only saw the commercials, you might think most drug companies are basically interchangeable. Different logos, same white coat promises.
But on the enforcement side, you see the same names over and over. The same companies paying massive settlements for deceptive marketing, price fraud, or fueling the opioid crisis, sometimes more than once.
In this episode of Big Pharma Behind the Scenes, we're exploring profits versus penalties, big government settlements against Big Pharma. The way large corporations fight lawsuits when their drugs, medical devices, and other products they make and market hurt people. I'm Terry Turner.
And I'm Whitney Bona, attorney and consumer safety advocate with Drug Watch. In this episode, as we hear about repeat offenders and giant settlements, I'll connect those patterns to what the law actually does and doesn't do to change corporate behavior.
There's no public three strikes and you're out rule when it comes to Big Pharma and litigation. Even when companies rack up penalty after penalty, regulators don't announce that they're now on probation. In fact, there's little sign that a bad track record stops a new drug from getting approved.
A major analysis by Public Citizen found that from 1991 to 2021, federal and state governments brought almost 500 cases against drug manufacturers, resulting in more than $62 billion in penalties. Meanwhile, just 35 of the biggest companies earned about $1.9 trillion in net income over part of that period. Even those huge fines barely dented the profits.
Public Citizen found the most frequent repeat offenders included Pfizer, Novartis, GSK, and Bristol-Myers Squibb, with anywhere from 9 to 15 actions against each company. The biggest settlements were paid by Purdue Pharma, Johnson & Johnson, GSK, and Pfizer, ranging from $4.7 to $9 billion.
Today, we're going to build our own accountability index, looking at some of the biggest government settlements and who showed up on that list. When you see the same companies paying billion-dollar penalties over and over, it's natural to wonder, does that history ever catch up with them?
Do regulators at the FDA look at a new drug from a repeat offender and say, hold on, we've seen problems here before? Or is every application treated as a clean slate no matter how long the rap sheet is?
We put that question to investigative reporters Shannon Brownlee and Jeannie Lenzer, who've spent years looking not just at individual scandals, but at patterns across the industry. We asked them if they'd noticed if the FDA treated companies any differently if they had a history of controversial approvals or post-market safety failures. Here's Lenzer.
They all have such a long history. I published in my book in one page full of all of the drug companies and their penalties that they had to pay for fraudulent advertising, for bad drugs, and all of them, whether it's Merck, Lilly, GSK, Pfizer, they all have millions and millions and millions of dollars in payments. It's the cost of business. That's all it is.
Lenzer says the first thing to understand is that repeat offender isn't an outlier. It's the norm. She's filled whole pages just listing the penalties big firms have paid for fraudulent advertising, misbranding, and bad drugs. It includes Merck, Eli Lilly, GSK, Pfizer, one after another, year after year.
Public Citizen's numbers back that up. Their report found hundreds of state and federal cases over 3 decades, but only a handful of companies account for a big chunk of the total penalties, and some keep returning to the enforcement roster.
Here's Brownlee and Lenzer.
The question, of does the FDA treat them any differently? I don't see any evidence of that. They look at drugs coming from a company that's done wrong in the past with a little bit more of a jaundiced eye. I don't think that's true.
Well, it could happen and we wouldn't know it, but, in general, it seems that companies can have an absolutely horrific reputation but they don't have a reputation. I mean, that's the thing. People have no idea that companies repeatedly violate what are considered to be scientific standards.
Well, I actually think there might be a problem for the FDA if they did view companies that had problems in the past. If they did penalize them, I think that would be not okay. really for the companies.
Brownlee points out that if the FDA openly said, we're going to be tougher on this company because of past misconduct, it could potentially create legal challenges. Approvals are supposed to be based on the data in front of the agency about the specific drug, not the company's reputation.
The result is a strange split. In enforcement reports and advocacy studies, you see long rap sheets and repeat violations, but most patients and even many doctors never see that picture.
That's where the public citizen analysis is useful as a kind of scoreboard. Between 1991 and 2021, they found at least 482 settlements or judgments against drug manufacturers, totaling about $62.3 billion in penalties.
And most of that enforcement isn't ancient history. From 2018 to 2021 alone, they counted 70 settlements worth $23.7 billion, with a big spike in opioid-related cases. In just 2020 and 2021, $16.3 billion, about 81% of all settlements with state and federal agencies in that period, came from opioid litigation.
They also highlight top repeat offenders. By number of settled cases, Pfizer leads the pack, followed by Novartis, GSK, and Bristol-Myers Squibb. By total dollars, Purdue, Johnson & Johnson, GSK, and Pfizer sit at the top of their list. That gives us a starting list of companies that keep running into trouble.
But even $62.3 billion in penalties over 3 decades is really small compared to $1.9 trillion in net income for a few dozen big firms over just a portion of that time frame. That's why the report's authors call this pervasive wrongdoing that penalties alone haven't disciplined.
To understand what those massive settlements actually do and don't do, we went to Nora Freeman Engstrom, a Stanford law professor who studies how public health litigation interacts with regulation, drawing lessons from tobacco and opioids. We asked her how to assess whether public health litigation is actually changing corporate behavior or if companies are just absorbing lawsuits as the cost of doing business.
I think sometimes you see both. And I do think that for me, it is you see changes when you see, litigation, the information unearthed, the kind of story told can then, if it infiltrates the popular imagination, if it becomes something that people then know of, oh gosh, those are bad actors, or oh gosh, folks are being irresponsible, that, often regulation and legislation is a lagging indicator, right? And then, but then sometimes they kind of, again, startle awake and take real steps. And we saw that in, cigarettes for sure. We saw that the information comes out and then there's the oh, well, let's change cigarette taxes and let's make it so you can't smoke in these public areas and let's, regulate secondhand smoke in this way. And I do think you can't just attack a public health problem on kind of the ex post, which is what tort law does. Tort law comes in after the fact. You already have an injured body or a dead body by the time tort law comes to be. You need to have this ex post kind of wake up that then can trigger the ex ante regulation. And when they work hand in hand, I think we see real changes.
Professor Engstrom's point here cuts right to the heart of the public citizen data we discussed earlier. Those repeat settlements, Pfizer, GSK, Johnson & Johnson, showing up again and again, only become more than a cost of doing business when the litigation unearths information that shifts public perception and pressures regulators to act.
She describes tort law as an ex post tool, arriving after the harm is done with injured patients in the picture, but one that can spark ex ante changes like higher cigarette taxes, indoor smoking bans, and dropping fatality rates when plaintiffs' lawyers dig deep enough to expose the full story.
That takes a motivated plaintiff's bar. Plaintiffs' lawyers who specialize in these complex cases willing to invest millions in risky, years-long cases, plus what she calls private attorneys general, filling gaps left by cash-strapped or conflicted public agencies. When that evidence then wakes up legislators and regulators, as it did with tobacco and more recently opioids, you see real behavioral shifts beyond just writing checks. DrugWatch compiled a list of major government settlements.
cases that help put faces and dollar amounts to those enforcement patterns. We should note, these types of settlements simply resolve the allegations government agencies leveled against a company. As part of the settlement, there's no determination of liability on the part of the company. The 4 biggest settlements are all tied to the opioid crisis and show just how wide the responsibility spread, from drug makers to distributors to pharmacy and grocery chains.
Companies like McKesson, Johnson & Johnson, CVS, Walgreens, Walmart, Purdue Pharma, and Kroger agreed to multi-billion-dollar deals to address the damage caused by addictive painkillers.
That takes care of the 4 largest settlements. Number 5, GSK paid $3 billion to the U.S. Department of Justice in one of the largest healthcare fraud cases on record. It resolved criminal and civil charges that included failing to properly report safety data for the diabetes drug Avandia and illegally promoting several other drugs for unapproved uses.
Number 6, Takeda paid $2.4 billion after being accused of hiding diabetes drug Actos bladder cancer risks.
Number 7, Pfizer's $2.3 billion settlement with the DOJ included a record $1.3 billion criminal fine and resolved allegations of off-label promotion and kickbacks tied to drugs like Bextra, Zyvox, and Lyrica. It was billed as the biggest healthcare fraud settlement in U.S. history at the time.
Number 8, Johnson & Johnson appears again with more than $2.2 billion in criminal and civil penalties over its marketing of Risperdal and Invega, cases involving accusations of illegal promotion and kickbacks to doctors and nursing homes.
Number 9, Abbott Laboratories paid about $1.6 billion, including criminal fines and Civil False Claims Act penalties, over allegations that it illegally promoted Depakote for unapproved uses.
Number 10, Eli Lilly closed out our list with a $1.4 billion settlement resolving charges that it pushed the antipsychotic Zyprexa, marketing it aggressively to elderly patients and children for conditions the drug wasn't approved to treat.
And as a bonus, Merck's $950 million deal with the DOJ over Vioxx combined criminal charges and civil claims related to alleged illegal promotion of the painkiller. Now, this is separate from the huge wave of private Vioxx injury lawsuits we've talked about in an earlier episode.
When you add these together, plus other federal and state cases, you start to see what Public Citizen was talking about. Tens of billions in penalties concentrated among a relatively small group of firms, with opioids dominating recent recoveries.
And yet, in the bigger picture, these penalties are a small slice of total industry profits. When you look at the numbers, Public Citizen's analysis suggests that for some of these companies, even giant settlements can be absorbed as a cost of doing business, especially when there's no strong follow-up enforcement or criminal accountability.
$62 billion in fines compared to $1.9 trillion in net income is like being fined $62 from your $1,900 profit.
Or paying $1 in fines for every $32 made in net profits.
Public Citizen also notes that prosecutions of individual executives are rare and that criminal actions are a small share of total cases. Most of the time, the company writes a check, signs a compliance agreement, and moves on, often without most patients even realizing that anything happened.
That's why the report calls for more focus on criminal conduct and more use of whistleblower provisions at the state level, so insiders who see wrongdoing have a clearer path to exposing it, and regulators have stronger tools to respond. To understand what that looks like from the inside, we asked whistleblower advocate Lewis Clark with the Government Accountability Project what it takes to bring a case against companies with this much legal firepower.
If you're going to blow the whistle on something like the pharmaceutical industry with its power and certainly its finances and its legal arsenal, you need to really have counsel that can get you through the gauntlet of raising your concerns. If the problem is so severe that the revelations would impact the worth of the stock itself, then you have a case potentially there. But there are a number of excellent whistleblower laws, but they're complicated, and how they're applied is uneven. It's a gauntlet, but there are avenues there to have significant impact and to see that people don't die.
Clark says anyone thinking about blowing the whistle on a major drug manufacturer needs legal help right away. Between securities law, False Claims Act provisions, and specialized whistleblower statutes, it's a maze, and whether a case moves forward can hinge on whether the misconduct affects stock value or government spending.
He describes the process as a gauntlet, but also points out that when these cases succeed, they can have a real impact, bringing dangerous behavior to light, changing labeling and marketing, and sometimes saving lives that would otherwise be lost to unsafe products or deceptive practices.
In other words, those massive settlements we just listed don't just materialize out of nowhere. They depend on data, documents, and people who are willing to push through a very hostile environment.
So, Whitney, when you put all this together, everything we heard today, the public citizen data, the top 10 list we put together, and Lewis's description of the whistleblower gauntlet, what does it tell you about how well our enforcement system is actually working from a legal perspective?
To me, this tells us something important. We're using lawsuits and settlements to clean up some of the worst damage after it happens, but we're not really changing the incentives that led to the problem in the first place. When a company makes $1.9 trillion in profit over a decade and then pays out $62 billion in penalties, you have to ask, is that really a deterrent or is it just a line item on a balance sheet? If the financial upside is still far greater than the downside, litigation becomes just another cost of doing business. The patterns pointed out by Public Citizen reinforce that concern. We see the same repeat offenders, criminal prosecutions are extremely rare, and a huge share of recent recoveries are all tied to the opioid crisis. So that suggests enforcement tends to spike whenever a public health disaster becomes impossible to ignore, and then it quiets down. It's reactive, not consistent. So what would actually make a real difference is changing the rules of the game. That could mean greater criminal accountability when misconduct is egregious. It could mean stronger protections and incentives for whistleblowers who speak up early. And we really need settlement agreements that actually change how companies market, price, and monitor their drugs. That is when litigation stops being just a cleanup tool and it starts functioning as actual real regulation. And without those structural changes, we shouldn't be surprised if the same companies keep showing up in the headlines and on the next list of record-breaking settlements.
And that's exactly what we'll explore next, how some of the biggest personal injury settlements and multi-district litigations look when you zoom in from the company level to the patients and families at the center of those cases.
Next time, we'll count down record-setting MDL and injury settlements and look at what they reveal about where the system has failed and where lawsuits have forced it to change.
You've been listening to Big Pharma Behind the Scenes from Drug Watch. If you found this episode helpful, follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And visit drugwatch.com for more on dangerous drugs, medical devices, and ongoing lawsuits.